I'm not going to go into the war very much, what's happening on the front lines, but the Japanese military from 42 really is going to be having a harder and harder time fighting this war. Japan's not a big enough country to have a huge army, but also there are just better opponents across the barrel, so to speak. So in 44, the Vice Admiral of the Navy creates a special force called Tokodai, which is going to be aiming to inflict the maximum amount of damage on carriers, on American carriers. Hopefully make them stop fighting this war as a last-ditch effort. There are not enough qualified airmen, right, to carry out these attacks. So, and Midway is the big battle, right, that Japan loses, and that is sort of the swan song for the Japanese military. And so they're going to be bringing student soldiers to fill these roles, drive their airplanes directly into American naval carriers and great damage. Kamikaze pilots that you may have heard about or seen movies about. What I think is interesting, I won't go into for time's sake in this huge detail, but is that they were not oftentimes as patriotic as we might have thought. They were doing this out of obligation. They're doing it for their families. They were not talking about the emperor when they died very often. And there's a whole book of diary entries from several of these pilots that has been translated that shows that it is not quite as emperor worshipful as we might have thought. But anyway, let's move on from there. This slide says ending the war. So what to do? Actually, back in February of 1945, the former Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro he writes a memorial in which he said basically that Japan should probably surrender because this is not going to be a good outcome for Japan. We'll have an American or Western Allied forces attack. We'll have uprisings from Japanese who are unhappy on the bottom. And meanwhile, I should also mention that people in Japan are being given a lot of information about how Japan is actually still ahead in this war and is still winning. So this message also is one that he is predicting will go over hard when Japan loses this war by force. So Japan should surrender now, he says. But that does not happen. The U.S. actually lands on Japan proper in Okinawa in March and have a 3-month campaign or 4-month campaign there. That is some of the hardest fighting during World War II anywhere, but especially in Japan. And they make their way through Okinawa, and this is kind of, I think, perhaps for the end of Japan. From there, they can then launch attacks on mainland Japan, so on Honshu and Kyushu, if need be, and they do so. In the meantime, the German surrenders in May. And try to find a way to sort of get out of this situation with some diplomatic escape, right? I'll show you a slide next of Tokyo firebombing, which is also an important element that was possible because of the Okinawa amphibious landing. Oh, and we also see the prime ministers change quite a bit during this time period. We have Tojo Hideki was prime minister for most of Japan's war with the West, but he is replaced in 44 by Koiso Koniaki, another general, and then by an Admiral Suzuki Kamaro, who is the prime minister when Japan fully loses this war against the West. This is the Tokyo firebombing aftermath. We think about the deaths that happened in other parts of Japan, which we'll talk about in a second, but this is actually a really big event for the capital of Japan to be firebombed or carpet bombed with over 100,000 deaths that occurred in the capital. And this should have been, I think, enough to demonstrate the might of the Western Allies and force Japan to stop their war, but the war did not stop. Journalists in Japan photographed the aftermath of the building of those who died as well. So we have people who died and who were charred by the bombing as well in the capital. So, despite that, Japan does not surrender, and the Potsdam gathering in Germany will bring together Winston Churchill, as well as the new President Harry Truman, as well as Joseph Stalin, to decide how to end this war with Japan. The declaration that they issue must unconditionally surrender. They must allow foreign troops to occupy the country. That Japan has to renounce all of its claims to territories beyond Japan proper, from Taiwan all the way to Burma. That there will be a war crimes tribunal, and that the Japanese people must be free to choose their own form of government, not just the government or those who are in charge of the actual people. So a more democratic government is required, and that most importantly, if they refuse to accept these demands and to surrender in this way, they will face prompt and utter destruction. There is still a lot of debate about what was and was not sent between the Japanese embassies in the United States and other countries to Japan and vice versa. But Japan did not surrender, did not give up. And there was no clear sign of surrender. And so what followed was the promised prompt and utter destruction, which took the form of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima on the 6th by the Enola Gay, which we see here. You can't see, but Paul Tibbets is the pilot at the top there, waving in that picture after he has finished doing this. Before he left to do this dropping. He drops Little Boy is the name of the bomb. The first ever bomb, atomic bomb dropped on a civilian population. And Japan still does not surrender. And again, we're still trying to understand even today what happened right during the next several hours. But not surrendering, the Allied forces dropped a second bomb called Fat Man on Nagasaki, another important port for troops and arms going to fight the war in China. And this, together, these two atomic bombs, which are still the only two bombs that have ever been used, and like our entire geopolitical system is based upon the threat of these, still today, the threat of these kinds of weapons, which have never actually been used besides these two times. They led to death from explosions of about 200,000 people, but then, hundreds of thousands more have died in the years after that, and many have even died since then. So massive casualties for mostly civilians by these indiscriminate weapons of mass destruction. Mushroom cloud that followed the first bomb on Little Boy, and this is the mushroom cloud of Nagasaki, second, when Fat Man arrived at the epicenter of that explosion, taken by the pilots who dropped these bombs. Here we can see the aftermath is utter and very much prompt. Struggling with this catastrophe. And I think I got through all this stuff. Okay, so I think I want to just make a few points. One of the points I want to make is that rhetoric of the government at this point in time is very much that Japan is winning this war. And as you may have seen, there's a food law that creates rationing, right? All the industries, all the unions, everything has been brought under government control. So we have people of Japan forced to work with government on everything, right? And to accept their leadership. And we have also this sort of untrue messages of victory that are very much part of how people are seeing this war. So part of why Japan does not surrender is because the people of Japan are not fully convinced that this war is unwinnable or that they are losing this war. So with the dropping of not one but two atomic bombs on Japan and the devastation of Tokyo, there was no choice for Japan but to surrender. So Japan does surrender, and it is Emperor Hirohito who orders the cabinet to surrender on August 14th, 45. He does so in a broadcast that has been called the Jeweled Voice broadcast, in which he describes what has to happen to Japan. I ask you all to read a couple pages from John Dowd on this or not, I don't remember. So when the emperor makes this broadcast on the radio, it is quite a surprise to hear him speak because he actually has quite a high-pitched voice, not a very low-pitched, impressive, powerful voice. And also he is using relatively archaic Japanese, very sort of sophisticated, high-level, classical Japanese to make this speech. But the speech's content, people took a while to understand as they crowded around radios to hear the message. At the end of the war, they got the message. So I'm going to give you a chance to read through this here briefly. And this here is the Potsdam Declaration, right, of the unconditional surrender. He continues. Before I show you the last part of his speech, what are some of the messages that stand out in this part of the Jeweled broadcast from the emperor? What is he saying to Japan's public? Nick?
That it wasn't their wish to like countries and take over, rights away. It was just to secure.
Equalization, prosperity.
Yeah.
Does that seem like
An accurate statement?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of an understatement, or at the very least of Japan's goals. And that's how he chose to phrase, or how his writers chose to frame this. But he recognizes the war has to end, and that the trends of the world have turned against her interests. So, it just kind of was, as my students often say, grad students, it was contingent. Things could have gone differently. And we could have been on top of things, but they did not. And this is actually true. Had this been happening maybe 20 years before, they probably would have not had all these issues with the Western countries opposing their willful infringement upon other countries' sovereignties. So anyway, things don't go well for Japan. He also talks about this cruel bomb as a key reason for stopping the war. And he, as Emperor of Japan, leads Japan in paving the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come. But he ends with this phrase here: enduring the unendurable and suffering what is unsufferable. this is a very vague phrase, but it also, I think, says a lot. Japan could not lose this war, but they did. People of Japan were not prepared at all to lose this war because they had been told they were winning this war for 4 years. So the defeat was just, cataclysmic for people of Japan. When the government announcement came, right away, the country turned to trying to figure out how to turn the page. The government officials began to burn documents. There were fires going for weeks of documents being shredded and burned. The imperial, Kokutai no Hongi, the cardinal principles of our national polity that were in schools throughout Japan, they were burned so much that it was hard to find examples when the occupation does arrive in Japan. We also see that the black markets that had been sort of growing during the war in times of rations and scarcity, they blossomed. And especially minorities like Taiwanese and Koreans in Japan were able to make use of this new system of opportunities and to be able to make a profit. And the Yakuza becomes even more prominent in Japan thanks to these so-called blue sky or black markets. The cost of things was very, very high, even more so than during the war. And we have crops failing, we have people who are starving as well. There is a term that we see a lot in the papers of the time for about 3 or 4 months, and it is kyodatsu, which means exhaustion. People of Japan, this is actually, I think, a poor translation. I think the better word is like sort of like a psychic break. Like they had like a nervous breakdown collectively because they had not been prepared to win this war. They'd given so much. So this is a word that I think begins to embody this time period. So in the aftermath of the war, right afterwards, the U.S., Great Britain, China, and the USSR form an allied council as to how to administer the aftermath of the war for Japan. But the real person behind this in leading the charge is General MacArthur, who is a general in the U.S. In the U.S. Army. So he comes to this position having already fought for the United States and led successful campaigns in the Philippines. So he comes already being in the East and Southeast Asian area to come and then bring, hopefully, a new democracy in theory, but at least the end of war to Japan. So it is in all senses of the term a dictatorship in which MacArthur is the supreme commander of the Allied powers, and he himself holds all authority, or he's the end of authority, I should say. His first goal and his charge was to demilitarize Japan, to remove Japan's ability to wage war. This was also the goal of the atomic bombs, first and the second one of those, but he's going to then come on the ground and then carry this out in person. Hopefully later on, he hoped that Japan would be able to use its existing government structures of democracy, which had been, in his view, sort of weakened, to build and establish a sustainable democracy. So demilitarize Japan and then democratize Japan. But the sort of underlying and not so invisible other theme behind these policies and efforts of MacArthur was to keep the other allies, especially the USSR, out of Japan, to make Japan into a sort of a key part in the U.S.'s ties to East Asia as a whole and to the continent, and to maintain that priority for the United States. So France, Great Britain, Netherlands, they also are part of this Allied Council for Japan, and then we'll also see the creation a few weeks later of a 10-nation Far East Commission, which includes more countries. Here we can see the U.S. and Great Britain, but also Australia, also New Zealand, India, etc. They're all going to be parts of this larger commission to deliberate on how to carry out the occupation of Japan, which was called for by the Potsdam Declaration. George Sansom was a very famous medieval historian of Japan, but he was part of this commission. For example, E. Herbert Norman here, also another famous historian of Japan, who were part of these processes. This is a picture of the first meeting of Emperor Hirohito with MacArthur. It was taken and it was put in newspapers all throughout Japan as well as in the United States. They were going to discuss the future of Japan. And I just wanted to take a second and ask you to use your very active visual senses to tell me a bit about what's happening in this picture. So, and analyzing this image, what are the things that stand out to you? It's a piano in the background, in case you're wondering, obviously, yeah. Zach?
The postures are completely different.
Okay, how so?
MacArthur looks relaxed and just standing around. Where it almost looks like he's afraid, he's rigid, I guess.
Okay, so like those are great observations, right? So the emperor, very rigid, right? Definitely not at ease, right? To use the sort of military stance terminology. And MacArthur definitely is at ease. He's not looking very official in his posture. So what does that posture tell us about MacArthur in this picture then, that he's at ease? What does this stance send as a message to the viewer or to you today looking at it? Jonah? I think so, yeah. I think he believes he has authority, and he does. And the picture could have been adjusted to make them seem almost the same height, you know, like Tom Cruise in movies, right? That's what's happening here is a very visible show of superiority, and his stance also reflects that. So these are things that we can take away. So this is how Japan, this meeting took place actually at the headquarters of the occupation. So the emperor had to leave the imperial palace and then come and ring the doorbell and go talk with MacArthur. So a very, very quick change, right, in social structure and interactions that happens here. As you saw in Barefoot again, people of Japan were very, very afraid of Americans. They were afraid of American men, soldiers, as beasts coming to rape women. They were afraid of the violence that they were hearing that Americans were perpetrating against Japanese as they flew and sailed towards Japan. So one of the most interesting parts of this, and I won't go into it in much detail, is that the Far East Commission and the U.S. Army and Navy were very aware of this image, and they gave out a lot of books and training videos and other materials to help the Americans to know the Japanese people better, full of racist stereotypes, but with the goal of having them not be so terrible when they got to Japan. One of the things that we see is that they arrive, the soldiers who were first in Okinawa, they move outside of the military spaces and they go into Okinawa proper, and then they move up through the rest of Japan. That they were interested in trying to win over the Japanese. Can anybody see what's happening here in this picture? Kind of hard to see. It requires some imagination. So here we have children, and there's a soldier. Michelle?
He's giving them something, maybe like candy or something?
Totally, right? So he's giving them a chocolate bribe. So we have a lot of this kind of interaction happening, a lot of the early sort of stories about the occupation, meeting Japanese civilians is of them trying to allay their fears, and chocolate was one of these sort of key and successful media for doing that. So the U.S. goes from their first sort of base to actually taking and occupying Japan at these bases. And these bases are still in Japan today. So that is how the occupation takes place spatially, right, throughout Japan. The occupation has all these different sections. And as you can imagine, finding mostly Americans to come and fill these different roles was difficult. And as you will see as you watch the speech or the lecture given by Beata Sorta-Gordon, who I'll mention in a second, there was a lot of chaos and a lot of sort of happenstance that took place in filling these different sections of the occupation. Everyone had an important role. There was diplomacy, there was natural resources. They were thinking, an important one was also the education and civil information section that worked on textbooks. They all had important roles to play, but I want to focus on the government section as the most important for today's lecture. The government section was the section that was in charge of the sort of legality of the occupation and how they were going to make a new blueprint for Japan's future. One of the things that they called for early on was that the emperor needed to cease to be the religious leader of Japan. So they called for that. Many Japanese communists who had been imprisoned, and also socialists, many Japanese Christians, many others, also some who were just trying to find a way for Japan and the emperor to continue to exist and not have to have the emperor be tried as a war criminal. They called for him to disavow his divinity. And he does so on the first day of 46. And the text was actually written by the Minister of Education, Maeda Tamon, who actually was in competition with British and American scholars working on Japan. He himself having been not yet disciplined as being part of the pre-war government. So the emperor issues this statement, and every paper in Japan, big paper, national paper or major metropolitan paper has this document. People didn't actually care much in Japan. This was actually a text that was mostly read and translated by Western audiences and interpreted as a sign that Japan was going to move forward peacefully after the war. Here is the text of that, very briefly. And what I'll sort of draw our eyes to here is that going back to the Meiji period, the emperor argues that the 5 clauses of the Charter Oath, right, of the Meiji period, are not actually predicated on the false conception that the emperor is divine, and neither on Japanese racial superiority. So it disavows these important claims that actually are fundamental to how the Charter Oath was carried out. If you'll recall the ritual that took place to announce the Charter Oath to Japan's imperial ancestors, talked about how people of Japan were encouraged to take part in a simultaneous show of reverence while the emperor was announcing the Charter Oath to the ancestors. And we can also talk about the emperor being, the head priest of state Shinto, all of these things. But this document seeks to undo that. And so, although there is a lot of debate about secularity and about the religion and state separation in Japan today, which we'll talk about more as we go on in the class, this particular element does stick. The emperor is right away no longer a divine figure. The government section also drafts a new constitution. And I will not go into detail because I think it's a really interesting story. You'll have a chance actually to watch this video that takes you through this process. But the occupation does bring in several experts on Japan, as well as some people who just happen to be in Japan and have Japanese language skills, to draft a new constitution for Japan. While Japan's freed political sort of dissenters and other politicians, they also draw up their own constitution, and there is some debate between these two. But eventually the occupation authorities and MacArthur are not satisfied with the Japanese draft. It's too much like the old Japanese constitution. So the occupation basically creates a new constitution, especially new sections and new ways of defining things like freedom of assembly or freedom of religion, speech, work, labor organizing, collective bargaining, those kinds of things. We also see very, I would say, revolutionary clauses added about equality in marriage, as well as in divorce, and either inheriting or bequeathing or owning property for women. And these actually are rules, clauses that go even beyond the US rights that women had at the time. So not able to vote yet in Japan just yet, but that will come as well. But these clauses are quite important. So I'm asking you to watch a video in which Beata Sorta-Gordon tells her story and how she was part of this process. A very top-down, oppressor, sort of initiated imperial or neo-imperial process that does all the same give people in Japan these new rights that are much more than there were before. It also includes Article 9, which you've probably heard about in the newspaper as an important article of the Constitution. This so-called Peace Constitution contains an article which dedicates Japan to peace. People of Japan renounce war as a right of their nation, and the right to use war or force, I should say, as a means of settling international disputes. And they also lose or they cede the right to maintain land, sea, air forces, or other war potential, making Japan one of very few pacifist countries in the world at the time. These elements actually were largely drafted by Japanese and not by American pens, but it is the occupation's constitution which then eventually puts this into practice. Excuse me. It is easy to see the occupation as a benevolent force. They give out chocolate. They gave people rides when they were far from home. The occupation makes this pretty impressive right-granting constitution that is more democratic, definitely than what came before it. But as you can imagine, imperialism is never that. It's never all rosy. So I want to go over a few things that are not quite as positive. You may recall the story of Okichi, who was the consort servant assigned to Townsend Harris, the first U.S. consul back in 1856, the one who eventually negotiates the Townsend Treaty, which opens Japan to trade with the rest of the world. So Okichi's story has become legendary, and what we see is that her image as sort of a buffer against foreign male intrusion into Japan, it's brought back again. The occupation, in discussing with the Home Ministry of Japan, takes part in this process of buffering Japan against the male sexuality and violence of the U.S. military that's being perpetrated. He hopes to create like a dike to hold back the mad frenzy of occupation troops using the bodies of Japanese women, just as the shogun did with the body of Satokichi or Okichi in 1856. The reality is that there were many rapes, even in the very few weeks. I mean, actually, in the months, I should say, before Japan's surrender of women in Japan by American soldiers. So this was a real thing. The question was having women's bodies be a buffer the solution to that problem. I will leave you to think about that. We discussed this a little bit before, right? As a consort, as a sexual buffer, the image of her is again resurrected in things like Barbarian and a Geisha, which stars John Wayne. But anyway, back to 1945, the Japanese Home Ministry creates a recreation and amusement association, which aims to promote mutual understanding between the occupation forces and the people of Japan, and to smoothen diplomacy at an unofficial level and work towards more peace. And they put out a call to try and get women from to come and take part in this great task of comforting the occupation force. This idea of comforting soldiers, right, in order to soften their depravity. We saw it with comfort women being used in Japan's various colonial locations, and we see it being used here as well in Japan, although in this case these were not people taken prisoner or tricked into taking part as much, I should say. So the RAA is very much a licensed, state-run brothel system. At its height, it was only on for about a year. There were 70,000 women who took part in this. Women who came from the water trades, which is a euphemism for the sex industry, were recruited, although they were not the only ones. And it would cost about $1 for American soldiers to have sexual intercourse with one of these sexual buffers, if you will, or comfort women in the Japanese sense. And there were already 31 centers, or RAA centers in Tokyo alone, within a couple of months. And this government initiative was financed by the IDF of Japan, and it was a big success. American soldiers did flock to these locations, and they were just oftentimes just big rooms with cots and blankets, no privacy. But this is one of the things that we can see as an intentional effort by the Japanese to soften the blow of the U.S. Military's arrival in Japan. And then the U.S. military was on board with this. Eventually they had to stop, largely because of the spread of STDs. That was really what stopped this. It wasn't some sort of a desire to create more, a less terrible policy. But in general, the occupation came very much in alignment with Japan's sex industry. They really worked very closely together, even after the closure of the RAAs in 46. The occupation troops spent over $38 million for sexual services. There were different kinds of sex workers, so I'll mention that in a second, but a lot of venereal disease, a lot of knowledge of the occupation authorities about sex workers, and that a lot of GIs also fathered children who they did not then stay to look after, which creates a whole other problem in Japan that we won't go into in this class much, but this is, as you can imagine, an important source of new births and also of orphans or single parent households. I mentioned the panpan here. So a panpan is a kind of sex worker in the post-war period, more in the occupation period. The panpan would be a sex worker who is really appealing to using typically like Western clothing to appeal to a certain audience, wearing Western clothes, typically oftentimes drawn or depicted or photographed with cigarettes, and walking and trying to find clients, especially around U.S. military bases. And there are the prostitutes for black or for white servicemen or for Japanese or Western men that were also sort of this kind of divisions existed as well. So this industry is partly occupation, and it must be seen as such. The occupation wants to democratize Japan. It wants to demilitarize Japan, and it supports the Japanese Home Ministry's efforts to smooth things over between the servicemen and the people of Japan through sex. But it also does put its mind to removing all of the weapons, both policy and actual weapons of warfare that Japan has used. So between 45 and 48, businesses that were deeply involved in empire, they are largely dissolved, and high-ranking executives in companies like Mitsui and Mitsubishi that were involved in the military industrial complex of Imperial Japan also were forced to retire, if not fired. Many officials as well in the pre-war government also were forced to retire or were fired. State Shinto, which as we have talked about a little bit in this class, was a civil religion or a state religion, but it was still a religion. And so before there even is a new constitution, the occupation forces Shinto to declare itself a religion, and to stop distinguishing between folk Shinto or shrine Shinto and state Shinto, and removing all of its ties to the state. That same month in 45 in December, the law governing religious corporations also is passed or announced, which requires every religion to be registered as a corporation and to have only rights as such, and none of which are allowed to have any ties to the government. So this is how the initial separation of church and state in Japan and post-war Japan does happen. The primary target of these laws is, can you guess which shrine might have been the primary target of this legislation? Anybody have any guesses?
Yasukuni.
Yeah, thank you, Rashil. So Yasukuni Shrine is the shrine that has been an emblem for Japan's militarism. It's funded by the Navy and Army ministries. It is the focal point for recruitment of soldiers. Soldiers who are going to be part of the Tokkotai, they're going to have this image of Yasukuni oftentimes in the cockpit. A very important central focal point for these individuals. The shrine was slated for destruction. This is the shrine today. But interestingly, MacArthur chose not to prosecute the emperor as a war criminal, and he chose not to destroy Yasukuni Shrine. And interestingly enough, which you can't see, this I thought it was gone, but it's here again, is that there was the Religions Division, which was part of the Civil Information and Education of SCAP, the occupation. They pulled together the top Japanese scholars of religion, as well as the top scholars they could find on Japan in the United States and Canada, and asked for their input. And actually, it was a couple of Catholic priests in Tokyo who mediated between these groups and argued that Japan needed a place to mourn its dead. The same way that the U.S. had places to mourn the war dead, Japan needed to have that. And that more importantly, if they destroyed Yasukuni, which is kind of a metaphor for the emperor in this case, the consequences on the country were unknowable. The possibility of an uprising against the government, against the occupation, were very possible. That people in Japan also, because of the abolition of state Shinto, were certainly in a time of spiritual confusion, and that the occupation, as a benevolent and sort of positive torch-bearing institution, would not look good if it destroyed Yasukuni. So they decided to keep Yasukuni Shrine. That's why it's still there today. to cause lots of controversy all the same. The special hired police, whose goal was mostly to gather information and suppress dissent and punish dissenters, was disbanded. The biggest, Zaibatsu, lost the central holding companies that ran their networks. Mitsui and Mitsubishi, the two largest of these Zaibatsu, were broken up, but not dissolved. And Yasukuni was not removed. And the emperor, as I said before, was not tried as a war criminal, and that is another thing that is still today being debated as to how and why this happened. But the same kinds of forces were involved at trying to find a way to maintain the peace that was in Japan and not draw Japan's resistance to the occupation. And lastly, Japan's military was dissolved. So the imperial military, the army and the navy, they are both dissolved as well. From spring 1946, the next phase of thinking about going from purging and dissolution to actual punishment takes place. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, War Crimes Trials, or the IMTFE, as oftentimes abbreviated, took place for more than 2 years. The commission's members were the ones who sent judges. So Canada, Great Britain, the United States, Netherlands, etc. They mostly adjudicated on war itself. They arrested 39 suspects in categories of A, B, or C, with the worst category being crimes against peace. They charged these officers, mostly officers, with these crimes. Here we can see the former Prime Minister, General Tojo, with an interpreter speaking into his ear in the National Military Tribunal for the Far East. So the Class A war crimes are about waging not just acts of war, but the actual war itself. So this is in the major category of unprovoked war against China, aggressive war against the United States, inhumane treatment of war prisoners and others, and not preventing atrocities. These are the categories that fall under Category A. And I mentioned 39 people were tried. I think only 12 were executed for these crimes, including Tojo Hideki, who tried to commit suicide but was impeded from doing that and was executed. This was not the end to the war, though. The war, post-war occupation, they really continue beyond this point in pretty important ways. One way is bringing people from Japan's military back to Japan. So when the war comes to an end, there were over 6 million Japanese soldiers and civilians in the Soviet Union who had surrendered to the Soviet forces, had to be brought back or repatriated. Here we can see a ship taking people back. We have some pretty impressive accounts of what it was like to experience this. Many military personnel, sorry, that's not right, 6 million plus throughout Japan's empire and its territories that were adjacent to its empire. There were only 750,000 personnel in the USSR. They were mostly in Siberian gulags, so they were in prison and work camps, but they were allowed to leave through the negotiation of the US and Japanese authorities. Soviet civilians were very cruel to Japanese soldiers, as well as to Japanese civilians in Japan's colonies, Manchuria and Korea in particular. A lot of rape and murder, but especially ill treatment of women was very common. About half of Japan's settlement in Manchuria was murdered, and again, there's a really interesting story written by a woman who was a young woman, an older child at this point, about her return from Manchuria. Her father was in the government, but how she left Manchuria and how the Chinese workers were very kind to her and took care of her, even as her father and family fled for their lives to go. And she talks about the ships that were carrying Japanese settlers back from Manchuria were actually targeted by both private and official incendiary devices, and so not everyone made it back, even once they got to the ships. And this is an interesting sort of post-colonial history moment as well. Anyway, the Philippines, also a Japanese population there of almost 70,000 people, have to also be repatriated back to Japan. So this was a very messy process. The occupation was not paying for this to happen, right? So it was a very long process, and a lot of people a lot of Japanese soldiers in particular, did not come back right away. There are many stories of them being afraid of being captured, being certain that the consequences of surrendering to the American military in places like Guam would be their decapitation or their murder. So they really held out. Some of them stayed and made new lives in Japan's far-flung colonies or the areas where the army was fighting. Some also resorted to cannibalism. Some committed suicide rather than be taken by American soldiers. Some of these individuals didn't come back even until the 1970s. So the cost of war, the cost of repatriation, these were just parts of the chaos and sort of the economic upheaval that took place in Japan in the early occupation period. There was no work. There was very little by way of wages, and there was still rationing from the wartime period. I mentioned the black market was flourishing, and the inflation that was happening was astronomical. 500% inflation in '47, for example, making it profitable to be a black market vendor, but hard to be anyone else. So the occupation brought in an expert, a banker from Detroit named Joseph Dodge, to come and try and right Japan's economic ship, so to speak. He had already been helpful in developing the West German economic plan for restructuring, which is part of the larger Marshall Plan. So he had some experience with this kind of process. He became the advisor, financial advisor to the occupation. The dates that you can't see there are from 1549. So his arrival coincides with a bit of a shift in policy, but I'll get to that in a second. Here we see him meeting with Japan's Minister of Finance, who will become later on the Prime Minister, Hayato Ikeda, and sort of cementing their alliance to try and help Japan to recover economically. His policy requirements are more taxes being brought in, lowering spending, taking away government manufacturer subsidies. So that's sort of taking removing some of the ties between business and the government, reducing public works, welfare, education spending. So these are conservative measures as well that he recommends. He also recommends less consumption. People need to buy less. I mean, and Japan needs to also up its export output. and that the exchange rate between the US dollar and the yen should be established at this rate, a new rate that was going to be fixed. So these are things that he thought were going to make things better. And they were effective. I mean, within 5 years, Japan's economy does actually reach pre-war, pre-1940, 1937 levels. So it was successful in that sense. But these elements here of that are conservative in terms of sort of economics, these elements are part of a larger trend that does not bode well for the policies that were in place for democratizing Japan. In the background, socialists who had been imprisoned or had been fired or had been censored, who had been talking about Japan's war in China and eventually its global war as problematic and had disapproved of it, they come back out of prison, they come back out of hiding, they begin to publish again. They say, "I told you so," right? And they oftentimes are able to come back and work in the government. The unions again take off in 46 as well. Student demonstrations also take off, and in this sort of fervor, we have May Day as well as October strikes in 46 that are without precedent. They're very large demonstrations that happen, and what ends up happening is that these scare the occupation. They see this carefully sort of cultivated and nurtured new democracy that they're trying to help take root, challenged by too much public outcry, too much political agitation. So initially, the occupation is talking with unions. The unions are in favor of a program to distribute land more evenly throughout the country. We also see that labor management councils are created in companies, even big ones, to negotiate wage increases and avoid strikes. But by 1948, these currents are becoming too much of a challenge for the occupation, who hope at some point to leave Japan, right? Mostly US soldiers and officials who want to see Japan on its own. And so they decide to shift the narrative. So in 48, which is more or less when they think about bringing on Joseph Dodge, the occupation shifts to prohibiting communism in Japan, or fighting at least against it. That they want Japan to be a non-communist or to be a capitalist country. They would like to see Japan helping the United States to defend democracy in Korea, and therefore fight communism in Korea. And so they moved to forbid general strikes and labor unions. They moved to forbid public employees from striking as well. They blacklist communists and fire 20,000 of them in what's called the Red Purge. And this is, contemporaneous. This is contemporaneous with American efforts to also identify and remove communists under the work of Senator McCarthy in this country as well. So we can definitely see the hand of the U.S. in this policy, the occupation, but the U.S. in particular in this policy. And so we call this the reverse course. They just go from one extreme of openness and democracy to not too much democracy and more, call it repression. And the last step in this is the creation of Japan's Japan's self-defense force. So Japan's police reserve is transformed into a self-defense force by MacArthur in 1950 by his order to protect Japan. But it is not a small defense force. It is in fact a full-fledged military that is created for these aforementioned goals of thwarting communism and its spread, and of helping to support U.S. efforts to suppress communism in Korea. And it is today one of the world's largest militaries, even though it still has this title which allows it to exist somewhat legally under the Peace Constitution of Japan.